It's Klayton, aka Celldweller, Circle of Dust, and Scandroid. Something very profound happened to me at the end of 2015. I finally, after 20 plus years, got the rights back to the first 5 albums I ever made. So that was Circle of Dust. That was really my first main musical project. It was kind of like an industrial metal kind of thing, electronic in nature, but definitely on the heavier and darker side. So what ended up starting as me just buying those rights back, remastering the albums and putting them out, had me start thinking about how much I know now compared to what I knew then. And if I were to produce the music I heard in my head back then, now, how much different would it sound? So I wanted to do an experiment, and that experiment turned into me creating and releasing on December 9th of 2016 a brand new Circle of Dust album called Machines of Our Disgrace. So let's jump in and look at what I did differently on production for this album to make it sound modern but stay true to the classic sound that I was creating in the 90s. So a big part of my sound actually had to do with the sampler that I used in the 90s, which was an Ensoniq EPS 16 Plus. It was a mono sampler. It was a 16-bit sampler, but it really kind of downsampled. It sampled that 13 bits, which gave everything a really crunchy character. So samples and sound design has taken quite a few leaps over the last few decades, and it sounds really clean, really pristine, and that really wasn't the sound that I was going for. So because I love to make a lot of work for myself and complicate my life, I decided what I would do is take some modern sample packs that I own, sample them into my Ensoniq EPS 16 Plus, cut them up, map them to keys, and then bring them back into my computer. And all that is just so that I get that crunchy 16-bit sound that the Ensoniq has. So here's a copy of Contact, which is what I ended up housing the samples in. I ended up bringing them from the Ensoniq sampler back into the computer in the digital world in Contact, but it used the converters in the Ensoniq to make this kind of crunchy sound. So here you go with this instrument I made called 2016 Samples through the EPS, and that contains all kinds of modern samples that are now still kind of crunchy and gross sounding because of the converter. And I just made a bunch of fodder for myself that I could span across the record, just making rhythms and things that I wanted to, and sound design that isn't cut out of movies and that I actually own, but with that original sound. As you can hear, a sample like that sounds like metal, kind of crunching and a machine running, but if I were to take that and pitch this down by, say, 2 octaves, that's the sound of Circle of Dust in the 90s, because you've got that super crunchy top end that sounds kind of like it's aliasing, and it's a little gross, and then you run that through some delay and you end up with these sound beds that I really haven't been able to replicate any other way. Another key aspect to the sound that I made in the 90s was that although I was a drummer, I liked the sound of a drum machine. I liked the sound of programmed drums. I liked the sound of single shot drums repeated over and over again. And so what I did is I went back to some of my original samples that from those early albums, and again brought them in. I converted them into a Contact format, so I have it in the computer and I have more control over it. So here's some kicks and snares that I used during the Circle of Dust era. There you go. All kinds of kicks and snares right from the 90s. And then I would take those and stack them and EQ them and make them sound a lot better than they did back then. So in the case of a song like Neophyte, which is on the new album Machines of Our Disgrace, that kick drum came out of a song called Nightfall. That was on the very first Circle of Dust album, but I ended up compressing it, EQing it, and took what was kind of a big, overly bass-heavy kick drum and made it slam a lot harder, and it sounds kind of cool in that track now. I also ended up using a copious amount of drum machine samples from old drum machines. So here's a Boss DR550, which I owned, but I no longer own. That got tossed out a long time ago and it stopped working. Unfortunately, I should have kept it. But what I ended up doing is mapping a bunch of DR550 samples into battery. And there you go, I have a DR550 again. So So I'm in the session for a song called Humanarchy, which is on the new Circle of Dust album, Machines of Our Disgrace. And I programmed a lot of drums, the kicks and the snares mainly, so that they sound kind of robotic in their rhythm, and that's because I like the sound of that. But I also, as I said, was a drummer, and I like the sound of live instruments as well. So I combined that with some like live cymbals, live hi-hats and stuff to end up creating beats that sound both mechanical and somewhat organic. So I ended up taking my guitars and chopping them up and editing them. I've also loved the sound of a hyper-edited guitar. It's played live, obviously, but I end up intentionally, even on those old albums, doing like one-shot samples with a guitar riff because I like the way that a repeating guitar sound sounds. This feels a lot more live, and I'm using ToneForge's Menace plugin for the distortion. I have Mesa Boogie heads and Soldano heads, like physical hardware heads, but this ended up giving me the tone I wanted. And after editing through my guitars, I end up with that. And the last thing really was vocals, and that was kind of a big deal because back then I didn't understand compression. I didn't even know what a compressor did. I never had any formal training, and I figured it out on the fly. What I did discover is that distorting my voice, running it through distortion, would keep my vocal at a constant level on a track. Now that's not necessarily the right thing to do, but that is what I did on those early albums because I didn't know what else to do. And that is part of my sound. So for Circle of Dust and even in the new era, I wanted to take the vocals and process them pretty heavily, and I ended up doing that using a lot of modern plugins, a few distortion boxes, physical hardware ones that I have, but a lot of plugins that you have and can use, like Isotope Trash and FabFilter Saturn, etc. So thanks for sticking through this video. I hope you learned something, at least a little bit, about how I'm producing Circle of Dust in 2016 and beyond. And it's just a little bit of taking the old ideas and trying to format them into the new, but staying true to the old vibe. Check out the album Machines of Our Disgrace, out December 9th, and stay tuned for more. This is Klayton, aka Celldweller, signing off.